Elvis Presley was known for his voice. For decades, it was the one thing no one questioned, the one thing that always showed up, even when he didn't want to, even when everything else felt fractured, until one day it didn't. One day, Elvis walked into the studio and refused to sing. He locked the door behind him, and for hours, no one knew what was happening on the other side. Stay until the end, because this is the story of the moment Elvis stopped performing on command and chose silence instead. The studio was ready long before Elvis arrived. Microphones positioned precisely. Sheet music stacked neatly on the stand. Engineers behind the glass checking levels. Tapping fingers against consoles with practice and patience. Everything was prepared for his voice. Elvis stepped inside without ceremony, nodding once as the door closed behind him. The room smelled faintly of wood cables and old air, a familiar environment that had once felt like refuge. Today it felt tight. He glanced at the microphone, then at the clock on the wall. The red light wasn't on yet, but the expectation already was. Sessions had schedules. Songs had deadlines. Silence was never part of the plan. Someone spoke through the intercom. "Whenever you're ready." Elvis didn't respond. He stood still for a moment, hands at his sides, breathing slow. The quiet stretched. Engineers exchanged glances behind the glass, unsure whether this was delay or defiance. Elvis walked toward the door instead of the microphone. He turned the lock. The click echoed louder than anyone expected. Inside the control room, confusion spread instantly. Someone leaned toward the mic, asking if everything was okay. Another tapped the glass, smiling awkwardly, as if this were a joke that would resolve itself. Elvis ignored them. He sat down on a chair near the wall, elbows resting on his knees, head slightly bowed. The microphone stood unused, a few feet away, waiting. Minutes passed, then more. Behind the glass, concern replaced impatience. Someone tried the door. Locked. Elvis didn't move. The refusal wasn't dramatic. It wasn't angry. It was absolute. For years, Elvis had sung through exhaustion, through doubt, through pressure disguised as encouragement. His voice had become the solution to every problem, financial, emotional, logistical. Sing and things move again. Sing and silence disappears. But today, silence was a point. Elvis felt something inside him reach a limit that had been approaching for a long time. Not suddenly, gradually, invisibly. Each demand layered on top of the last, until even breathing felt negotiated. He thought about how rarely anyone asked if he wanted to sing. Only when. The studio door became more than a barrier. It became control. Inside that locked room, Elvis was an asset or a solution. He was just a man sitting with the weight of his own fatigue. The intercom crackled again. Elvis talked to us. He didn't, because talking would have turned this into negotiation. And he wasn't negotiating anymore. He stared at the microphone again, feeling the pressure radiate from it, not physically, but symbolically. That stand represented expectation, obligation, the assumption that his voice was always available, regardless of cost. Elvis stood and walked toward it slowly, then stopped just short. His throat tightened, not from fear, but from recognition. If he sang now, nothing would change. The cycle would continue. So he stayed silent. Behind the glass, panic began to surface. Schedules were being recalculated. Calls were being considered. Someone suggested forcing the door. Another voice hesitated. "Let's wait." Inside the studio, Elvis exhaled deeply for the first time that day. The refusal was a rebellion. It was survival. And no one outside that locked door understood that yet. The silence didn't scare them at first. In the control room, people assumed this was temporary. A pause, a mood, something that would pass once the tension eased. Elvis had taken breaks before. He had pushed back before. Silence, they believed, was just another phase to manage. Inside the studio, Elvis felt time stretch in unfamiliar ways. Without the rhythm of recording, without the countdowns, cues, and takes, the room felt exposed. Too quiet, too honest. Every sound he made belonged only to him. The shift of his weight, the slow breath through his nose, the faint creak of the chair beneath him. This was what it felt like to be present without performance. Elvis stood again and walked slowly across the room, his footsteps soft against the floor. He didn't avoid the microphone this time. He stood in front of it, close enough to see his reflection in the metal grill. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Not because he couldn't sing, because he couldn't start. The realization startled him. Elvis had sung through everything: illness, heartbreak, exhaustion, grief. He had learned how to override his body when his mind hesitated. But now, something deeper was holding him back. This wasn't about sound. It was about permission. He realized how rarely he had given himself the right to stop, how often silence had been framed as failure instead of necessity. The studio had never been a place where he could simply exist. It demanded output. Always. Elvis stepped back from the microphone, his chest tight, his throat dry. The idea of forcing the first note felt wrong, not difficult, but dishonest. Behind the glass, someone pressed the intercom again, their voice careful now. "Elvis, we just need one take. You don't have to finish." One take. Elvis closed his eyes. That phrase had carried him through years of compromise. One take became one song. One song became one session. One session became another obligation, accepted without question. He sat down again, rubbing his hands together slowly, grounding himself in the physical moment. His voice wasn't gone. It was protecting him. The studio door rattled slightly. Someone testing it again. No force, just pressure. Elvis didn't respond. He wasn't punishing anyone. He wasn't making a statement. He was listening. Listening to a part of himself that had been drowned out by expectation for too long. The longer the silence lasted, the harder it became for the people outside to explain it away. Calls were made. Voices lowered. The tension thickened. Inside, Elvis felt something unexpected. Relief. For the first time in a long while, no one was taking from him. No one was shaping his output or timing his usefulness. The locked door had turned the studio into a boundary instead of a demand. He realized then that refusing to sing wasn't the crisis. The crisis had been singing when he had nothing left to give. Elvis stood once more and looked around the room. The cables, the stands, the equipment that had captured so much of his life. He felt gratitude for it, and resentment. Both could exist. The intercom crackled again, softer now. "Take your time." Elvis almost laughed. Time had never been offered before. He didn't answer, because this moment wasn't about reassurance. It was about reclaiming something that had slowly slipped away, the right to decide when his voice belonged to him. The pressure didn't explode. It condensed. On the other side of the locked door, the studio had stopped functioning the way it was supposed to. Schedule stalled. Conversations lowered. People spoke in fragments now, careful not to say the wrong thing too loudly. Silence had become disruptive. Inside, Elvis felt the change before he heard it. The intercom stayed quiet longer than usual. No reassurances. No countdowns. No gentle nudges disguised as concern. They were recalculating. Elvis stood near the wall, arms crossed loosely, listening to the absence. He understood now that the locked door had done more than give him space. It had interrupted momentum, and momentum was the one thing the system depended on. Without his voice, everything stopped. That realization didn't empower him in the way he expected. It sobered him, because it meant how much had been built around his output, and how little around his well-being. A knock came at the door. Not aggressive, not urgent, measured. "Elvis." A voice said, closer now. "Can we talk?" Not sing, not record. Talk. That alone signaled a shift. Elvis didn't answer immediately. He walked to the door and rested his palm against it, feeling the solid barrier between himself and the expectations waiting outside. "Through the door," he said quietly. There was hesitation on the other side. "Okay." The conversation that followed felt different from any he'd had in that room before. No instructions, no time frames, just questions, tentative, careful. "What's going on? Are you all right? Do you want to stop the session?" Elvis closed his eyes. Those questions should have come years earlier. "I can't do this right now," he said simply. No explanation followed. None was required. The silence stretched again, but it wasn't tense this time. It was respectful, fragile, but real. "We can reschedule," someone offered. The word reschedule hung in the air like a concession. Elvis realizing that the power had shifted not because he demanded it, but because he withdrew what everyone relied on, his voice. Elvis stepped back from the door and sat down again, the weight in his chest easing slightly. This wasn't victory. It was recognition. He wasn't a malfunction. He was a person who had reached a limit. Outside, the studio began to move again, not forward, but sideways. Calls were made. Plans adjusted. The machinery adapted. Elvis stayed where he was. For the first time, he felt no urgency to return to the microphone, because now the silence was doing the work for him. When the door finally stayed quiet, the fear crept in. It arrived without drama, settling into Elvis's chest with familiarity he hated. He had lived with this fear for years, even when he pretended otherwise. The idea that if he stopped producing, stopped delivering, stopped being useful, someone else would step in to fill the space. That was how the industry worked. Voices were assets. Silence was a liability. Elvis leaned back against the wall, staring at the ceiling, letting the thought finish itself this time instead of pushing it away. What if they don't wait? What if this refusal became proof of what's already whispered, that he was difficult, unreliable, past his prime? The fear wasn't irrational. It was trained. He had been rewarded for endurance since the beginning, praised for singing through illness, applauded for finishing sessions no one else could survive. Somewhere along the way, resilience had turned into expectation, and expectation had turned into entitlement. Elvis understood that the locked door hadn't just protected him. It had challenged a belief everyone shared, including himself, that his value depended on constant output. He stood and approached the microphone again, not to sing, but to look at it more closely. It felt smaller now, less commanding. Just a tool, not a judge. The fear softened, not because it disappeared, but because it lost its authority. If they replaced him, he realized, then the relationship had already been transactional beyond repair. And no amount of singing would have fixed that. That truth felt brutal. It also felt freeing. Elvis stepped away from the microphone and sat back down, grounding himself in the decision he had already made. He wasn't refusing to sing forever. He was refusing to be owned. And ownership, he finally understood, was the real threat, not replacement. Hours later, the knock came again, gentler this time. "Elvis," the voice said, "we're calling it for today." No pressure, no bargaining, no hidden demand. Elvis stood slowly, his body stiff but steady. He crossed the room and unlocked the door himself. The click sounded different now, not defiant but deliberate. When he opened it, no one rushed him. No one spoke immediately. The studio looked subdued, rearranged around his absence. Someone met his eyes. "We'll try again when you're ready." Elvis nodded once. That was enough. He walked past the microphones, past the glass, past the expectations that had waited so patiently for him to break. No one stopped him. No one asked for assurances. And that, more than anything, confirmed he had done the right thing. Outside the studio, the air felt lighter, not because the problem was solved, but because he hadn't betrayed himself to solve it. Elvis realized then that sometimes the bravest thing a performer can do isn't to deliver. It's to stop. Elvis didn't sing that day, but his voice came back. Not immediately, not magically. It returned slowly, after rest, after space, after silence was allowed to mean something other than failure. When he stepped back into the studio days later, it felt different, not easier, honest. He sang because he wanted to, not because the clock demanded it. The first note felt grounded, intentional, not forced. And everyone heard the difference. No one mentioned the locked door again. No one needed to. The moment had already done its work. Elvis understood then that refusing to sing hadn't weakened him. It had recalibrated him. The day he locked the studio door wasn't a breakdown. It was a boundary. And boundaries, he learned, don't end careers. They save them.